So it's just me gonna chat around the lessons learned that we've been working through our work with Edinburgh Council on the development of their low traffic neighbourhood programme. We've been working with Edinburgh Council and Sustrans for the last 12 months or so. My role on the project has been project manager on behalf of AECOM and the design team, but also leading on the engagement strategy and delivery, and also oversight of the design aspects as well. In terms of agenda and what I'm going to cover, background to the city, and I think like the city context and the general context in terms of the world just now is important, and then a bit of background to the two projects which we've been working on and have just recently been approved, which is the Leith low traffic neighbourhood and Corstorphine low traffic neighbourhood. Again, with the focus on kind of lessons learned and the approach that we've taken, I'm going to chat through the data gathering stage, the engagement strategy, and then there's some of the design issues which have come up. I would note that I've only just joined the event, and I've not kind of seen the previous presentation, so apologies if there's crossover or potentially conflicting approaches that we've taken. But this is certainly the approach we've taken, and it kind of takes it from inception right the way through. So hopefully there's some lessons there that you can pick out anyway. There's about, I think I've got 40 slides now. I did try and pitch it for half an hour. So I'll try and keep my best to that, and at least less than me chatting, more time for questions and discussion at the end. So in terms of background and where low traffic neighbourhoods sit within Edinburgh's policy, the council has its city mobility plan, similar to local transport strategies elsewhere. This was approved by council in February this year. Now this is quite important because low traffic neighbourhoods are specifically referenced as a measure within the council's city mobility plan, and it is very topical in terms of the committee have just recently approved it. So there is that kind of political buy-in and support to develop a strategy which includes low traffic neighbourhoods as one of the strands and one of the elements to obviously increase sustainable transport, reduce air pollution, and reduce car dominance, and generally trying to make streets more accessible. So yeah, I think that becomes quite an important focal point when we consider how the project is developed and moves forward, in terms of how it interfaces with the council's committees and the political cycles and approvals that are required as well. Is that there is this underpinning a low traffic neighbourhoods and policy, which I think is really quite important. Moving on to kind of the more immediate context then, in terms of what's been happening on the ground, I think everyone's kind of well aware of what's been happening in terms of the pandemic over the past 18 months and the reaction to that, and the need on public health basis to put in infrastructure and changes to streets to support people walking, cycling, travelling actively in their local streets. As a result of that, as I'm sure a lot of people have been involved in, is the Spaces for People programme and the series of temporary measures which have been implemented, and that could be temporary measures for, again, footway widening, local improvements to crossings, cycle tracks, and also it could be closing streets, school restrictions, traffic restrictions associated with that. Obviously, as part of the Spaces for People and pandemic response, there was an urgency due to public health to implement all those measures. So it was a fast track process, and one of the criticisms of that is that there was obviously little engagement with local groups, local residents, local stakeholders. So as part of that, particularly in Edinburgh, there was quite a bit of opposition put to. There was initially a low traffic neighbourhood proposed under the Council Spaces for People programme, going back a year or so now. The low traffic neighbourhood was proposed again through similar approval processes, the rest of the Spaces for People measures, with limited engagement, and again on the basis of improving the streets for public health grounds. Now, as a result of that, there was quite strong opposition groups which formed in the communities there. Again, mainly opposed to the lack of engagement and process, the Spaces for People involved for the low traffic neighbourhoods. So ultimately, the council chose to drop the LTNs from the Spaces for People response. And as you can see here, in the council's transport committee in October 2020, the council then made a commitment that any low traffic neighbourhoods which the council would deliver, there would be a commitment to engage with local residents on those proposals, and that any low traffic neighbourhood that the council put forward as part of the programme would be delivered as a trial under an experimental TRO, and the commitment to monitor and adapt any proposals before they may become permanent. So I think that's just a kind of quick potted history, but it becomes important just in terms of the framework of how the project's set up and the framework of approvals that are required as well. So the proposals, the two schemes that I'm going to chat about are on the basis that they're trials and they are experimental TROs. And alongside the committee recommendations in October, there was then a commitment to report back to committee at the key project stages. So when a final design was seeking approval and to start the the ETRO process, and also then to report back after the ETRO process to approve before implementation. So I think as a result of that, there is a kind of strong level of assurance through the kind of council's reporting cycle and also kind of the political scrutiny that will be put under it. I think it's worth noting that having to obviously deal with fitting in with the committee cycles as well does have programming impacts. So it's something that we have planned in through all our programmes. I think, as I'm sure if the audience here is local authorities mainly, so obviously with committee cycles, there is obviously the need to draft your reports and have everything ready. I mean, for Edinburgh, it's almost a month before. So you're having to then build in your programme these time periods to get all the reporting and just the assurance aspects of it in place as well. So that's something else that I think is quite important to note, that if there is going to be any sort of, whether it's statutory approvals needed through council committee, making sure that you plan for all the necessary sign-offs and lead-in timescales for those. It's also worth noting here that the fact that it's built into the council's committee cycle and the approvals is that it then there is then the interface with politics in general, I suppose, and also like elections and such. So that is something that if we are, again, just that point of looking ahead, planning for if there is approvals needed and looking ahead to generally what the political cycles are and what political climates and what's going on. And that's something that it's not had an immediate impact on our projects, but it's something that we're mindful of. In terms of the two schemes that I'm going to chat about in a bit more detail, we've got Leith, which is in the north of Edinburgh, and Corstorphine, as you can see here, just to the west of Edinburgh. Corstorphine, here's the study area is shown on the left. You can see that the study area that was selected for the LTN, it contains all the residential streets here bound by the kind of main roads of St John's Road to the north, Meadow Place Road and Carricknow to the east. Now, Corstorphine, in terms of the project area, there's 4,000 households there, generally kind of quite low density residential streets. There's a number of local centres and a couple of schools as well, quite central to the project area. We know that in terms of from inception, one of the reasons the project came about was that there is a long history of traffic issues which had been flagged up for the local community council over the past 5-6 years. And also that there's school streets restrictions that have been implemented around the two schools as part of the Spaces for People programme. The second project area is Leith. You can see here slightly larger project area. It's got 7,000 households in it. Generally, the kind of the housing density and the population density is a bit more here. You can see that the kind of, again, it's a lot of residential streets bound by the main roads as commercial street. Leith links to the south and then Great Junction Street to the southwest, sorry. It's also worth noting that within Leith there is a lot of planned and ongoing development, particularly to the north around the shore and the port, and also it's obviously got the tram line which is under construction just now and planned for delivery 2023. Both projects are quite key in terms of the council's strategic cycle network and have good connectivity to those. And Leith in particular has a cycle route planned, so it'll be a segregated cycle route as part of the tram project, which is planned kind of right through the centre of the low traffic neighbourhood. So that complements and kind of builds upon the low traffic neighbourhood as well. So again, from inception of the project, what we wanted to do is we needed to gather information to kind of set the scene and what was going to build up and inform the scope of what was going to become the LTN, the scope in terms of its physical extents, but then also the measures as well. So upon inception, we reached out to all the kind of local council officers, internal stakeholders to understand issues, opportunities, constraints of what's going on in the project area. Again, the local roads team in particular was helpful with that, and also local community representatives. School travel plans were really helpful as well. School travel plans obviously look at issues around accessibility and safety of streets as well. And early on, we also engaged with community councils. I think we developed quite a good relationship with community councils, and particularly the chairs. And we just reached out to them to understand kind of what the issues are and have been on their agenda for the last number of years with regards to traffic. And again, I think this was all really useful in terms of really understanding the scene, setting the scene and understanding the project areas. Moving on then, common place data. So through the Spaces for People programme, I know Edinburgh has, and I think a lot of local authorities have as well, is Common Place was set up to understand and map issues and opportunities, and particularly response to the pandemic, and trying in terms of improve accessibility. Now, whilst not directly comparable in terms of the questions that were asked, as part of the Spaces for People Common Place, it does also give another layer of information in terms of issues in the area and potential issues with accessibility, because it certainly, there is some sort of kind of key underlying themes within that. It is around trying to improve accessibility locally for people accessing their streets and local amenities. So there is definite crossover there, and Common Place data as another level of information, layer of information that you can start to map on where the issues and opportunities are. The next few slides I'm going to chat about are with regards to the traffic data and the analysis that we've done on that, which helped inform the scope as well. So to understand the existing traffic conditions in the project area, we commissioned and also kind of got receipt of historic traffic count data. Now, these were just your standard automatic traffic counts, and they were spread across the study area. I would note that this plan was just pulled out one of the briefs that went out, and we do have a far more extensive coverage of the study area that's kind of, again, gaps have been filled through historic information as well. So we do have a good spread of traffic data across the study area, and that tells us in particularly the patterns around speed and volume of traffic on each of the streets where traffic surveys have been taken. So I think, yeah, traffic data is a really important part in building up that picture and understanding the conditions. Now, when it came to actually obtaining the traffic data and using it meaningfully, again, I suppose we as professionals can understand what a generally high traffic road is and low traffic road is. But again, all the numbers are quite dry as well. In particular, when we're starting to look at guidance on classifying roads, particularly in the kind of urban residential setting, classifying roads against the volume of traffic, there was limited guidance kind of outside across the UK. So what we found was the council's got a street design guidance, which has been developed over the last couple of years. Now, the street design guidance has a chapter in it which looks at cycling interventions, and within the cycling interventions street design guidance fact sheet, it categorises streets based on the levels of traffic. Now, this is primarily aimed at understanding whether or not streets are safe or suitable for cycling on, based on the volume of traffic. And what you can see here is streets with less than 1,500 vehicles a day, it's accepted that within a 20-mile limit, it's considered safe for cyclists to be mixing with traffic. And now that's an indicator of generally how safe the street is for pedestrians as well. That then starts to introduce different thresholds for when we need to start considering intervention and when the streets become less safe. And that threshold again is 1,500 to 3,000 vehicles a day. And then above 3,000 vehicles a day is when it recommends segregation for cyclists from traffic as well. So I think that this is a really interesting and useful kind of tool to understand kind of where intervention might be needed and where street types and volumes are suitable and are considered safe and suitable. And I think it's something that became quite helpful when we were engaging with residents and we were showing them and chatting through the traffic data, as it then becomes quite visual, and they can understand kind of where the higher traffic roads are, and they can start to agree and recognise the patterns too. So as you can see here, kind of this is how we kind of showed it in our engagement materials, is that the streets with less than 1,500 vehicles a day through our traffic surveys, we generally determine as a kind of quiet residential street, typical residential street. And as the traffic volumes go higher, again, upwards of 3,000 vehicles a day, you're then about strategic roads, where it's generally not safe or suitable. And I think that, again, building upon this in terms of, albeit this was geared towards how safe it is for cycling with regard to volumes of traffic, there is various different bits of research out there in terms of relationship of volume of traffic versus the perceptions of safety within streets. and also the kind of social interaction which happens within streets as well, because we know that the less traffic, the more social interaction which happens, which I think is one of the key principles at the low traffic neighbourhoods as well. It's getting people out and it's trying to increase community cohesion and spend more time in your local communities. So we felt this was a really strong and useful kind of barometer for using to assess the traffic data. Then what you can see, this is kind of how we used it within our mapping. So we've plotted on the locations where the ATCs were taken, and then you can start to then plot on the routes with the traffic volumes which were higher than the threshold shown. And again, this is another kind of quite useful visual representation of, right, where are the problems, and showing it graphically in a map sense so we can start to layer on this information. And I think that's one of the key themes that I'll get onto, is this kind of layering of information, where the issues are and where the opportunities are. And this is another example. These are all the traffic data that we've got. Some of the traffic data we've got for the Leith project here, and you can start to see how we're highlighting the different streets, and we're able to use that to compare against streets which have came up through residents' concerns, and also use it to verify residents' concerns as well. Another key theme that's happened in each of the low traffic neighbourhood areas is the issues that have been expressed in terms of intrusive traffic and the claims of rat running. So we were quite keen to understand what the kind of through movements were in the area. And I think obviously when you come to trying to design and plan out what a low traffic neighbourhood is going to become, you are trying to understand where traffic's going to route, and then try and protect streets and mitigate against any impacts, and just generally try and balance where people can move through the project area. So I think having some sort of origin destination analysis can be really powerful to understand the routes that people are taking, and it can also be really useful to, again, verify some concerns that the residents have got and show and build in confidence to the process. So this is an example here where we knew that there was a definite desire line from the site to the Western Maybury Road through to Drumbray. And you can see here that in terms of the origin destination analysis and scope that we set out, is we set out this number of routes, the variations of routes which people could take to do that. Now, because the schemes that obviously we looked at this in the last year, and we were in the midst of the pandemic, so we reached out and we partnered up with Transurveys to look at alternative ways to investigate origin destination analysis. And they highlighted the new technology in terms of using satellite navigation data. So sat-nav data uses TomTom GPS data within cars. It generally covers about 60% of vehicles, depending on the setting and the context. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to backdate and go back into the historic traffic data that they've got on record to pull that out. So we were able to get origin destination and sat-nav data from 2019. And that then aligned against traffic surveys which we had in the project area as well. So we could verify the data and also use that to factor an uplift. Again, we've only got 60, the GPS only provides 60% of the volumes. We can then use the baseline traffic data from surveys to then uplift and understand the volumes of traffic which should be taking each of these routes. Now, what this satellite navigation data, here's a few outputs from the surveys that we got. Again, it plots on the routes taken, and it starts to give you journey times for each leg of the route and overall, and you can actually pull out speed data from it as well. Now, the most useful part, I think, from this traffic data was we've got this summary spreadsheet here. Apologies for all the information. I don't know quite how legible it is on your screens, but on the left-hand side, we've got the kind of route choices that I chatted about before in terms of your origin destinations. And on this right-hand side is a dashboard in terms of the summaries of the route choices and what choices the overall volume of traffic were taken. So the example that I chatted through there was the main distributor roads were Maybury Road and Drumbray. And what we actually seen was, albeit it was only 48% of vehicles which actually chose to do that to get from points A and B, vice versa. So what was interesting was that it then started to show that this route, for example, which was route E and also route F, that those were ones that we weren't really aware of locally, but there were ones that then we were able to understand that people are using this potentially to travel through the area, which isn't local traffic. And then when we want to build up the scope of the low traffic neighbourhood, these are streets that we need to be mindful of and we might want to protect or propose intervention on. Now, again, I think all of this data and the way it's been presented is quite visual and quite engaging. And it's another way that we, again, demonstrating, I think a big part of the process that we'll get onto the engagement stage is also kind of bringing the residents and the stakeholders on that journey with us and sharing that information with them. And I think this is quite engaging and they can then understand, again, the routes which people are taking and it, again, help build the case for change as well. So yeah, satellite navigation data is really helpful, and there is also, I understand that there's also opportunity to use that in a kind of real-time setting as well. So albeit we've established these kind of baseline traffic data is something that we can hopefully then refer back to post-implementation. Moving on to the engagement stage now and the task and how we approach that. So we've been through 2 stages of engagement so far on the projects. The first stage was information gathering, kind of blank sheet of paper. The second stage was then the concept design proposals. So I'm just going to chat through the kind of the approach to both of those and some kind of lessons learned. At the first stage of engagement, as I say, that was a kind of blank sheet of paper, and I kind of see this as building the case for change. This is really understanding the issues which are happening in the area, listening to people, but also it's a huge opportunity for us as a project to raise awareness of the project and raise awareness of the principles and opportunities that the low traffic neighbourhood has. So albeit there's an ask for us from the community to understand what their thoughts are and how they go about things locally, but it's also a good opportunity for us to inform them and present the case and try and sell the case for low traffic neighbourhoods as well. So yeah, I've just pulled out the aims and what we want to find out from the engagement strategy there. And again, what we want to find out is we want to be able to, after this first stage of engagement, again, blank sheet of paper, we want to be able to confirm the extents of the low traffic neighbourhood, the physical extents. We also want to start to understand and plot on the issues, opportunities, constraints, existing conditions and barriers that people have. And yeah, I think the other thing that we were keen and it follows through in both stages of engagement is around public spaces. And I think that's one key thing we were trying to push is the aspect of low traffic neighbourhoods and the opportunities that provides to kind of create new public space and improve public space as well. So that was kind of threaded through our strategies. Now, a decision we made at the outset of the project, and I suppose it was kind of recognising what has went on elsewhere. And I think certainly what's happened, what my view is from the wider landscape over the last year and a half through the pandemic is that people have potentially become more engaged locally and kind of groups have been formed for different things and potentially in opposition to different things. So we were quite keen to kind of control the message in this project as much as we could and engage directly with these local kind of influencers, local representatives, local stakeholders. So we at the outset we agreed to create a community reference group that we would meet with at each of the project stages, and it was another opportunity for them to feed back directly to the project team and also allow the community to feed back through these representatives to the project team as well. So we consulted with the Community Council on the membership of these community reference groups for each of the project areas. And again, that's another way to buy the Community Council into the process, engage with them and get them, again, at a level of confidence and assurance with them. So for each of the projects, we formed community reference groups and made them up of local community groups, parent councils from the schools, businesses, housing associations. We also tried to get local access panel and Living Streets representatives, as well as bus user groups. And I think that's been one of the strengths of the project. And again, I think meeting with them from inception to create the group, again, and then at each of the subsequent project stages to listen as well as feedback has been really quite good to develop that relationship and again build confidence with the community that we are listening and we do want to work with them. So I definitely think that's a lesson learned. Now, the first stage of engagement, again, that was about information gathering. So we had briefings with the elected members, we had information posted on the council's website. And I think with both stages, we're trying to channel everyone towards an online survey and to try and give their feedback there, just so we can handle it and analyse it and then report on it. We leafleted all the households in both project areas, and that includes the perimeter boundary roads. Now that became quite important as we got down the line because yeah, there's various claims in terms of how far you should consult on low traffic neighbourhoods, but it certainly feels as though that, yeah, the boundary roads are absolutely important in terms of consulting with and understanding their views as well as the people internal to it. Alongside that, we met with various stakeholder groups, including the Access Panel, businesses and community councils. So I'm just going to quickly summarise some of the findings that we had from this and kind of how we use them as well. Now, I come back to this point, the first stage of engagement, again, it's understanding the conditions in the project area, but it's also building that case for change. So we asked the questions of like, what prevents people from walking and cycling and making local trips? And again, safety of streets for walking, safety of streets for cycling, lack of safe road crossings came up strongly. And then when we look into that in a bit more detail, people had concerns around traffic volumes and safety in streets, lack of dedicated cycle infrastructure, and speed of traffic as well. We asked particular questions on where people felt there was issues or concerns around levels of traffic in each project area. And that's another thing, and I go back to that point about being able to map and illustrate where issues are and layer on that information. You can see here that when we asked the question of traffic levels, there was clear, strong responses on a number of streets, and we've just used it in terms of a heat map and where responses have came back. And again, it's another thing that's quite engaging when we feed back to the communities, and it can be used to, again, verify assumptions that have came through, and also can be used to cross-check all the traffic data that we've got to really, again, build that case. Again, similar questions were asked in terms of traffic speeds, walking conditions, cycling conditions, and areas suggested for placemaking. And I keep coming back to this point. For me, and again as a designer, for me it seems quite simple. It's just that layers of information. This is informing the scope of what the LTN is going to become. It's telling us where the issues are. We can use that to cross-check against the traffic data and modelling, and then we know what we need to address. So I think this process in terms of mapping things out using the heat map, again, it's useful on two fronts. One, in terms of building confidence, and two, in terms of actually designing it. This is telling you kind of what the design has to do. Moving on then to the second stage of engagement. So we developed a final set of proposals then. You can kind of see an illustration here on the right that we presented to the public back in June as our preferred low traffic neighbourhood proposals. So the aims of this second engagement was one, it was again, I think we were well aware that during the first stage of engagement, when it's a blank sheet of paper, it'll never quite get the same reach as a set of proposals. So we knew that with this concept design going public, that it was going to generate interest and going to generate people that hadn't touched the project before or come in contact with it. So it was another aim. One of our key aims was to just refer back and raise awareness of the project and raise awareness of all the issues and justification that we've got beforehand as well. And obviously then get feedback on what proposals are, but it's just as important to kind of justify everything that we've put forward. What we wanted to find out, again, if we can find out further issues, that's great. But what we really wanted to find out was feedback on the proposed interventions and general issues and opportunities in the study area. Apologies, this is quite a busy list here, but the engagement approach for the second round of engagement on the set of proposals was a bit more extensive than the first. So the first stage, we just reached out to local elected members to make them aware of the consultation. But this second stage, now it was a set of proposals, we briefed all the local elected members on the proposals justification for that. And we also briefed all the wider party spokespeople and committee members on the proposals, because obviously this was at the point after which the concept design is complete that a recommendation is going to go to committee to approve the proposal. So we were quite keen to make sure that all elected members were brought into this. It was obviously going to generate a local interest, and that they were well briefed beforehand in terms of how the proposals will come about, the fairly robust process that we've taken. Project website was set up, which is kind of shown here. We used StoryMap to host all the information. I think StoryMap was a good success, actually. It was really quite intuitive. People worked on it and it's quite engaging. Works on mobile phones as well. Like the first stage, we wanted to try and channel people towards the online survey so we can get and manage and process the feedback that we want. We Similarly, we issued leaflets to everyone within the project area. We'd since built up a project mailing list. I think that was one of the key questions that we asked at the end of the first stage. Do you want to be kept updated about the project? So a project mailing list of hundreds of residents who want to be kept up to date. So they were emailed about the consultation. Lamppost wraps were put out on street. Again, I think that was just at a point where restrictions allowed. And then recognising businesses, how important businesses are as well, we went door to door with businesses, handing in the leaflets and discussing the proposals with them. And then similar to the first stage, we followed up with meetings with all the key stakeholder groups, including the Access Panel, emergency services, business community. One of the other what became really important aspects of the second stage of engagement was we delivered some public co-design workshops. So this was aimed at really giving the public an opportunity to chat with the project team face to face, and I suppose it was trying to bridge that gap because of the issues that we've had in terms of the restrictions of the pandemic, of not being able to meet face to face and not being able to have these kind of more detailed conversations that you naturally have at events with the community. So we hosted 2 design workshops for Corstorphine and 3 design workshops online for Leith. Now, the process for that was, again, we were trying to understand how we could deliver it and how do we make it accessible to everyone but manageable. So we used Eventbrite to set up the workshops, and that allows you to manage the number of attendees. So you can limit that. We limited it to 50. People register. You then get their contact details, and prior to the meetings themselves, you can then send out background information and kind of meeting information to those individuals as well. So I think the Eventbrite setup and this use of the kind of online workshops worked really well. Similarly to what we would have done face to face, it was kind of facilitated workshops where we created small groups so people could actually chat through the nitty gritty of the details and the proposals. So you can see here's a kind of screenshot. So there's Martin, who was hosting one of the meeting rooms, and he was chatting through the proposals here in Leith around the shore. So we did have the fairly detailed proposals, showing the restrictions, showing the changes, and people were able to chat in a smaller group format, less intimidating, against the proposals and make sure they can put their feedback across. Again, we had kind of within Microsoft Teams, there's a function where you can create breakout rooms. So I was able to create 4 breakout rooms and assign different people to it. Again, a maximum of 10 people in each room, so it was manageable. And within Teams as well, you can record all the sessions. So that was something that was quite helpful for making sure that we had an accurate record of the conversations that went on, and we reported all these sessions as well. So I think this is another key thing, that when it came to kind of justifying the approach that we'd taken and the thorough kind of approach to engagement that we'd taken, it went down really well. Again, we got a lot of really good feedback for this as well, and I do think it was a really good way to reach out to the community, build a relationship with them, and also understand the kind of local issues which can make the schemes work a lot better. Moving on to the online survey then. So this is part of this is on the concept design proposals. So I mentioned before in terms of setting the aims of the concept design consultation, and I think we were quite keen to make sure that threaded through it was still that justification and the case for change. So there's an example, a question that we had here. So we kind of we gave a narrative in terms of how the proposal was developed. You see here, during the last round of engagement, this was identified. And that kind of you said we did when we asked the question. What we found really helpful after on the second stage of engagement was try to make sure we can get as much quantitative responses as possible, as much tick box responses as possible, just because when it came to analysing the open text boxes, it becomes a huge task for people to read through hundreds upon hundreds of survey returns. And you can see here for Corstorphine, we had, both projects with 800. And when you think of asking 10 questions, each with an open text box response, it could be, thousands actually in terms of responses that you're dealing with. So being clever about how you ask the questions, but also provide an opportunity for people to provide feedback where they can. That was really quite important. So I just wanted to kind of cover some headline results just to kind of show how the projects ended up unfolding. For Corstorphine, this is just feedback that was shown from one of the measures. Okay, Corstorphine, I think there was about 12 questions, and this is just one of them. The trends are generally the same across them, to be fair. What we've seen in Corstorphine was there was low levels of support for the proposed measures. And then when we look into that in a bit more detail, it was around the safety issues that people felt that was going to create on other streets, and that kind of caused increasing congestion and traffic and pollution on other streets as well. So I think generally, and I'm sure this discussion's went on before, is like there has to be an acceptance that they're going to be sensitive and they're not going to be widely supported by public from the outset. So I think that when we're asking questions about levels of support, it's definitely a really helpful gauge, but understanding why people are not supporting it is the most is useful for us as designers as well, because then we can understand, right, it's because people are concerned around the knock-on traffic, and then we can go and try and address that. What we also looked into for each of the project areas as well is kind of further detail in terms of who was saying what. So residents, when we look at the residents' trends against the overall trends of responses, residents were slightly less opposing to the measures. And also interestingly in Corstorphine, when we look at the school streets were far less opposed, and the school streets had more support. So that was interesting, and I think that point around if there's schools within LTNs, that's definitely something which should be a kind of key part of them, and they should be integrated with any sort of school travel plans, any sort of school streets measures, because that definitely has a lot more kind of naturally kind of public support and appeasement, I suppose. Moving then on to Leith, I would also note, sorry, I've just picked out a couple of graphs from each of the projects. All the information is available online. There's detailed engagement reports if people are interested. I can share the web details after this. For the Leith project then, Leith was far more balanced levels of support. So we can see here it's almost equal people supporting and opposing. So that was interesting. And again, when we look into the issues that people were feeding back in terms of why they supported or opposed it, we can see a lot of people actually felt it improved the area for accessibility. But there is that thought that it creates access issues as well and congestion. So similarly, people had concerns around congestion within and outside on the boundary roads around the study area. For Leith, when we start to look at the residents' feedback versus the overall patterns, and you can see generally the residents were more supportive. Again, I say more, slightly more, 30, so that 38% versus 33. But again, it does start to show a trend that residents who are affected by the existing conditions are possibly more likely to support them than those outside the project area. I would also note, just on the second stage of engagement, we did look into a bit more detail around residents who provided a home postcode in the study area. So those were ones, when we quote residents, it was those who provided a home postcode. Businesses, there was analysis done on all the business responses, those who consider themselves having a disability, and we also looked at different age groups. All these are reported in the final summary report, and it was good, just again as a sense check, for us to understand that we are aware of all the issues and concerns that people have on the proposals, and kind of generally what the levels of support and opposition are to them. Again, I think I've touched on some of the bits of key feedback that we got. I suppose the biggest concerns that we got across both projects was the impact on dispersion of traffic, and I think that's absolutely relevant and acceptable, and what you'd expect. Impact on traffic locally and also within the boundary roads. So I think for us as designers, it was us understanding that we learned that there was other streets within the study area that needed protecting. And we also learned that there's potentially a bit more flexibility needed for residents who live within the study area. So we did tweak the proposals to take light of those comments as well. And it also, when we started to consider our monitoring and evaluation plan, we'd obviously built up baseline data, but we quickly established that baseline data was going to have to go wider than just the project area. And it is those wider impacts that become really important when you start to consider congestion, air pollution, and public transport, which sits on those boundary routes as well. There's a general perception across both schemes from opposition groups that the scheme's just not required. They don't see the issue. And I think that's where it becomes really important when we say that kind of information gathering and building up that case for change. That's where that becomes really important to combat that question. There was questions around the research and the validity of it. So I think it's quite key that, again, people are well informed, that we understand the research, the limitations of which we are quoting as well. There is a lot of good research out there to support the findings, but also being able to recognise that there is limitations to it. Mentioned there about public transport being important, making sure that we're always in touch and keying in with public transport stakeholders too. Moving on to design aspects, again, sorry, and anyone that knows isn't, I will kind of bang on about evidence-led decision making. I think it has become really apparent that this is key in how the low traffic neighbourhoods and the proposals have become. These layers of information, it just targets where the interventions are needed. From feedback for residents, mapping that through to traffic data, through to traffic modelling, that informs where you need to target measures. And then from that, you can then start to develop options which address those and sift and prioritise those. I think that there is that, if there's more than one option which works professionally, proceed with that. We did for Corstorphine, we went out with 2 options, and that was really helpful as well to show that the residents can inform the changes, and it can respond to what people are going to say. We used micro simulation modelling for the Leith low traffic neighbourhood. That was really important during our optioneering stage, because from that we were able to model a lot of scenarios. Now there's obviously a lot of work going on in Leith just now in terms of with the tram, so we had to model kind of the impacts post-tram implementation, and yeah, traffic modelling was really helpful. And also from that, because it's a micro simulation modelling, we're able to pull out bus journey times. So on these key distributor roads where buses are in there, we're able to make sure that bus journey times are safeguarded as well, because it's all good and well saying, oh, well, we're trying to kind of prioritise walking and cycling over general traffic, but you need to remember that buses are within that general traffic too. And there has to be a level of traffic flow, so they are still prioritised. In terms of design details then, so some technical details, again, when we're designing these kind of point interventions, obviously these are the designs just now because they are going to be implemented on a kind of trial basis. So these are just kind of indicative temporary features in terms of bollards and street furniture. In terms of placement on street for these, I think it was really important. It became quickly important that how important waste and refuse collection is in these residential streets. There's always safety considerations if we need to get how waste collections are done, and I think there is guidance. I think it was quoted to me within British standards, I'm not sure, but certainly in development planning guidance in terms of the limitations on how far, say, a refuse vehicle can reverse in a street. But ultimately, yeah, refuse collection has to be done safely and it has to be accommodated, and that can then be quite restrictive when we're on about these tighter residential streets where you can then place point closures, etc. Driveways become quite important again, the density of driveways in these residential streets. We can see here that we've always had the compromise in terms of the refuse vehicle moving here, but also there's driveways to the south. Business loading and yeah, understanding the local area and making sure that there's still access to pharmacies and schools, etc. is really important. Another thing I just wanted to flag up as a lesson learned, probably because we're now at this point in time, is like materials and procurement's really quite important because these are low traffic neighbourhoods and there's a placemaking aspect to it. We've got this street furniture and it might be planting and you might want to use local suppliers and local artists. Lead-in times for these things can be quite difficult, and even procurement processes. So I think early on in the inception of low traffic neighbourhoods, understanding kind of what procurement routes are available, what materials are available could be really important, especially when you start to develop visuals for the project. So if you quickly know that there's certain products, manufacturers that you have to use, it's best shown that in the outset rather than trying to set expectations with different materials that are potentially higher quality, etc. as well. Within the ETRO, that has certain limitations. I think there's this thought that an experimental traffic order offers some flexibility, but it still follows the same process as a traffic regulation order. So Within the proposal that we are putting forward for our ETRO, we're actually including interventions that aren't within the proposed scheme, and those are interventions that we think might be required in future. So it's trying to preempt those issues that could happen, and that's came up through traffic data that we've got and also through residents' feedback. As I say, everything's also, in terms of the design of the LTN, it's all based on a balance of restricting through access but allowing local access. So again, it's just making sure that there's thought and that those things are planned and advertised alongside the main ETRO. So when changes are needed, there's an order which has been passed and that can be brought in place. I'm just going to close on the good news that the Transport Committee was last week, and both projects were put forward for approval in terms of the recommended LTN layouts and approval to proceed with the experimental traffic regulation orders, and the committee passed both of them. So that was a huge result for the project team, a lot of hard work that's happened in the past year, and the elected members also commended the team just in terms of the levels of engagement that was recognised and done as part of this, and the kind of robust process that was done. So although it is hard work, it's definitely worthwhile, and particularly noting how sensitive these schemes can and will be.